Okay, so yesterday we went over the elements, or rather the author's purpose for both nonfiction and for short stories. And then I had you get started reading A Retrieved Reformation by O. Henry. And so the goal of today's class will be to finish that up, and then you are going to be doing a bit of analysis of that story in and of itself. And so before you can do that, we need to go a little bit further with the elements of a short story. And then we'll be able to go into a bit more of a comparison between that and other things. So for our warm-up today, we're going to go through some of those elements that you'll need to analyze. Here we go. We have gone over plot before, and whenever we refer to plot, we need to know that we're talking about the exposition. The inciting incident, of course, is what causes the conflicts in the story to really begin. The rising action is the building and building and building of conflicts. The climax is the turning point, where the protagonist makes a decision to change, and that leads him or her on a different course. And that usually seems like a point of high action, but it's not always. Then you have falling action, because those conflicts tend to lessen because the protagonist has hopefully made a good decision. And then the denouement, or resolution, is where we find the conclusion of the conflicts that have ailed our protagonist. So, we know this. Think about how that is playing out in A Retrieved Reformation. And a lot of people get this wrong, because they tend to think of it in a very basic way. But your protagonist is not always good. Keep that in mind. Your protagonist in this story is Jimmy Valentine / Ralph Spencer, the guy who cracks open safes. So, what kind of inciting incident can he have that causes him to have more conflicts? What kind of conflict can a bank robber have? And what kind of things are going to cause him to have that increasing conflict with his plan to continue to rob banks? Then, at what point is he going to have to make a decision that's going to lead to problem solving for him? It's not a simple story. It seems like it is, but it's not a simple story. Think about that. Now, the exposition of a story, we want to make sure that we understand the setting being the time and place. You won't always know the exact time of a story, but pay attention to some of the little details. In A Retrieved Reformation, you have things like the fact that they're using horse and buggy, the fact that he's stitching uppers of shoes in prison. So those are some clues. Also the fact that they are giving him $5 to rehabilitate himself into society. Those are clues as to this is not a recent time frame. So those are some things to pay attention to. As for the place, we do notice that that changes throughout the story. So pay attention to the several places that he goes, and that will be important as well. And a lot of people, again, the inciting incident is a new or a relatively new 8th grade idea. You talk about conflict, you talk about rising action, but the inciting incident is that thing, that moment that starts the metaphorical avalanche, if you will. What causes the conflict from the very beginning? Think about it. What is it for Jimmy Valentine? I want you to write that down. take a moment and, as I'm asking you these questions, write your answers down in your notebook. Now, rising action is a number of things. It's not one particular thing. We know that. So we're not going to talk about every single piece of rising action. But within rising action, the most important thing to pay attention to would be, of course, conflict. So pay attention and think, what would be Jimmy Valentine's internal conflict that he faces? And what would be his external conflict that he faces? And obviously there may not be only one of each of those, but what would be the ones that seem to be the most important? Write it down. And as I mentioned on the screen earlier, the climax of a story is one of those things that kind of irritates me, that you have been kind of misled to understand when you're younger. You've been told that it's the highest point of action. You've been told that it's where everything starts to fall into place. It's a turning point. But it's not always super exciting. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. But you really need to understand that it has to do with the mental and physical state of the protagonist. Sometimes that is something that happens when they are in quote-unquote dire straits, in a point of really, really intense action going on where there's a fight or this or that or the other thing, but sometimes it's not. So where, or when rather, does Jimmy Valentine Ralph Spencer face this moment where he needs to make a really important decision? Falling action in a story is, as we've got written here, the conflict is supposed to lessen. Again, things that are sometimes misleading. When we talk about the conflict lessening, we're talking about the conflict that was burdening the protagonist, and then they made the decision. That doesn't mean every other conflict surrounding them, especially if the story is a more complicated one, those don't necessarily get any better. And a conflict lessening doesn't even mean that things get better. A conflict lessening could mean that things start to go away because, there's a lot of death. Like in stories where, the bad guy dies, that's because, we don't like death. That certainly helps a conflict to go away. It's not good, but it's certainly something that helps a problem to be dissolved. So, unfortunately, you have to keep that in mind. So, conflict going away does not mean that it goes away in a very good manner all the time. So, how does Jimmy's conflict lessen towards the end of the story? And finally, denouement, or resolution. What conflict is resolved first of all? Which conflict? Internal, external, what you wrote down earlier. And how would it be resolved, and for whom would it be resolved? Resolution is not always pretty or happy. So how is his resolved? Think about it, write it down. We're going to share out our responses to these once you're done with these videos. Or this video. It's not multiple videos. Alright, so After those notes now, if you did not manage to finish reading A Retrieved Reformation yesterday, then your first task is to finish it so you can finish answering the questions that I had there for you, because we don't want any spoilers. And we will be able to get together once everyone is finished, and we'll review the questions that I had just asked through this video. Then we are actually going to do a comparison. Before we compare with a nonfiction text, we actually are going to be comparing to another short story, one that's a wonderful piece, Thank You, Ma'am, by Langston Hughes, a famous author, an amazing author. And that one's a really short story. So we'll be able to get through that one, hopefully, really quickly. But you're going to do the same kind of process. So you want to keep in mind those same questions as you read through Thank You, Ma'am. So if you've finished and not everyone else is finished, you can get started on that one. I will have that up on the board, the page numbers for that one in our Prentice Hall book. All right, let's get started.